11 experts, six-figure contracts, years of experience cracking codes for governments and cartels, and not a single one of them could decode even the first line of that ledger. Josiah Kent had been patient for 2 weeks. By the morning of the 15th day, he was done being patient. He swept every file off the table, looked straight at the lead cryptographer, and said the words that emptied the room. "Get out. All of you." That's when the silence came, the kind that sits heavy in rooms with bulletproof glass and walls that have heard things no courtroom ever will. And in that silence, from the corner of the floor near the doorway, a girl with a smudge of ash on her cheek and a scrubbing brush still in her hand slowly raised her eyes to the open ledger on the table. She'd been scrubbing that floor for 2 hours. She'd heard everything. And she'd seen something on that page that 11 brilliant men had walked right past without knowing it. Her lips moved, just barely, just once, and Josiah Kent turned around so fast his chair hit the floor. What she said in that moment didn't just crack the first layer of the code. It put both of them in the most dangerous position in Chicago's entire underworld, and neither of them saw what was coming next. If you're ready for stories where the forgotten rise, where the powerless turn the game around, hit that subscribe button right now, drop a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let's dive in. The fire in the Ashford mansion never goes out. Not in winter, not in summer, not even on the nights when the rest of the northern Chicago suburbs sleep soundly, and the streetlights scatter over empty roads like salt on black cloth. The fire burns, because Josiah Kent demands it. And whatever Josiah Kent demands, the entire estate provides without questions, without delay, and without complaint. Ashford Estate sits on 12 fenced acres, sealed behind stone walls and a camera system, whose exact count no one knows except Josiah and his most trusted guard, a man named Jonah. On the outside, Josiah Kent is a 37-year-old real estate businessman with a portfolio stretched across the Midwest. On the inside, he is the head of the Kent Syndicate, one of the largest underworld empires Chicago has ever known, and he runs it with a cold discipline that the people closest to him both respect and fear. But discipline didn't save his father, it didn't save his grandfather, and it didn't save his great-grandfather. Josiah's great-grandfather was shot dead at the age of 38, in broad daylight, on the steps of a church on the south side of the city. His grandfather was poisoned at the age of 39, right in the dining room where Josiah still sits every night. His father, the only man Josiah ever trusted completely, died in a car explosion at the age of 37, on his way home from a meeting that no one outside the family should have even known about. Josiah is 37 now. He has reached the exact age his father never made it past, and every family record, every handwritten note with letters so tiny they look like they're trying to hide from the very page holding them, points to the same conclusion. The blood feud between the Kent family and the ones who methodically killed each man in his line wasn't random. It was systematic. It had an origin, and that origin is recorded in an encrypted ledger, hidden somewhere underground beneath this very mansion, inside a subterranean vault the Kent family has known existed, but has never been able to find an entrance to. The ledger holds the original proof, the first transaction, the first oath, and the first betrayal. Find it, crack it, and the spiral of bloodshed will end. That's why Josiah hired 11 cryptography experts. Leading them was Reed Calloway, 55 years old, a man who worked for the NSA for 2 decades before moving into private consulting for clients no government agency wanted to admit existed. Calloway arrived with an antique brass magnifying glass he carried everywhere, turning it in his hand like a scepter, and a confidence Josiah initially mistook for competence. 11 people. 2 weeks, and the result was a perfect 0. So complete, it almost echoed. The ones closest to Josiah could track his unraveling with brutal clarity. The way the shadows under his eyes shifted from gray to nearly purple. The way his jaw locked permanently, as if bracing for a punch that still hadn't come. The way he moved through the mansion's hallways at night, like a man walking inside his own nightmare. His black hair, usually slicked back with the deliberate carelessness of someone who never has to try, now stood messy from being raked through too many times. The black suit, the most expensive one in his closet, the one with silver stitching at the cuffs that made him look, inch for inch, like the boss he truly was, had been thrown over a chair in his office and left there for 4 days without anyone touching it. Josiah Kent hadn't slept properly in 14 days, and on the morning of the 15th, something inside him, something that had held its shape on sheer will alone, finally ran out of strength to keep going. Wren Abbott learned that truth on her first morning at Ashford 3 years ago, when she showed up at the mansion's back door with nothing but a worn old canvas bag and a name she was trying her best to blur until nobody bothered to remember it. The head housekeeper, a rigid woman named Mrs. Holloway, looked her up and down the way a cattle buyer checks stock at a market, hands first, then back, then eyes, and said flatly that she would scrub whatever she was told to scrub. She would be invisible when she wasn't needed, and she would never, under any circumstances, step into the third-floor office without direct orders. Wren nodded. She gave the small, harmless smile she'd practiced for years, and she became exactly what Ashford needed her to be: invisible. Every morning before the sun touched the horizon, she was on her knees on the floor. The mansion's stone was old and unforgiving, holding decades of grime that never fully surrendered no matter how hard she scrubbed. Her brush moved in the same rhythm every day, left to right, lines overlapping, rinse, repeat, and her hands had long since stopped feeling the cold water. The calluses on her palms were so thick that sometimes she pressed her fingers into them just to feel something. Her apron was permanently stained. Her cloth cap always sat a little crooked, and her amber eyes, sharp and restless eyes that saw everything, stayed lowered, always quiet, always safe. She hauled firewood before breakfast. She cleared ashes after dinner. She polished shoes she would never be allowed to wear, and washed sheets she would never be allowed to sleep on. She ate in the kitchen's corner with the other low-ranking servants, scooping up whatever was left in the pot after the upstairs had been served. And she did all of it without a single unnecessary word. The other servants thought she was slow, maybe a little dim. Nina Cross, a senior maid with a voice like a crow and opinions about everything, once announced loudly at the servants' table that Wren Abbott was the most boring girl she'd ever had to share a kitchen with. Wren looked up from her bowl of porridge, held Nina's gaze for 2 seconds, then looked back down at her food. Nina felt a strange unease for the rest of the night, and couldn't explain why. That was the thing about Wren. She wasn't slow. She was restraining herself. There's a huge difference between the two, and it was a difference she couldn't let anyone discover. Because Wren Abbott had a mind like a trap, precise, patient, and impossible to escape once it closed around a problem. She had a photographic memory she'd never told anyone about, the ability to see a page one time and keep it in her head down to every comma and semicolon. She'd known it since childhood. She'd known it the way people know fire is dangerous, not because someone tells them, but because they've felt the heat and understood by instinct that it can burn them to the ground if they aren't careful. That mind had once made her family lose everything. Her parents died when she was 14, in something the police called an armed robbery, but never truly investigated. After that came the foster homes, strange houses with strange faces, where she learned that being too smart was what made people notice you, and being noticed was the most dangerous thing in the world. She'd been on her own since she was 17, and the only thing she carried through every house, every road, every night sleeping in a car or on a bus station bench, was her grandmother's small notebook, wrapped in cracked leather, the only person who'd ever loved her without conditions. She kept it on her body every day, pressed close to her skin in the inside pocket of her coat, the way other people carried a prayer. That mind had already taken everything from her family once. She wasn't going to let it take it again. So she scrubbed floors, she kept her eyes down, and she survived. The third-floor office wasn't in Wren's scope of duties. Mrs. Holloway had made that painfully clear on the first morning. The room was cleaned once a week by the senior staff, the ones who'd earned the privilege of stepping into a space that held things worth more than a human life. Wren was assigned to the ground-floor corridor, the kitchen passage, and the servants' stairwell, the unglamorous anatomy of the mansion that kept everything running and was never meant to be seen. But 11 experts had turned the office into a battlefield. 2 obsessive weeks of code-breaking left the room in a state that made Mrs. Holloway press her lips together so tightly they went white. And when 2 senior servants called in sick on the same morning, truly sick, the mansion's cook could confirm it. She looked down the list of people she could pull and stopped on Wren's name with the face of someone choosing the least terrible option. She would wipe around the desk. She would not touch the ledger. She would not read the notes. She would not disturb anything on the main table. She would be finished before the experts came back after lunch. Wren nodded. She took her bucket and brush, and she stepped into the third-floor office for the first time in 3 years at Ashford Estate. The room was extraordinary. She'd known it would be. She'd caught flashes through the doorway while running errands, seen the spines of books that made her fingers itch, but standing inside it for real, with the high stone walls, the narrow windows, and the smell of old vellum mixed with ink and something even older than both was something else entirely. She stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds longer than she should have, then set the bucket down and got to work. She cleaned methodically and quickly. The stone floor around the central desk, the baseboards, the narrow paths between stacks of equipment and towers of documents piled up. The experts had just vacated the room for their midday break, leaving the desk momentarily unguarded and the room heavy with the silence of their failed attempts. She worked her way around the room with her eyes down, and she was close to the main table, close to passing it, when she saw the pages of notes. Reed Calloway's notes were spread across the left side of the desk, a stack someone had flipped through over and over, corners folded, annotations in 3 different ink colors. Wren didn't read them. She didn't even look at them directly. But the human brain, especially a brain like Wren's, processes information in peripheral vision, even when it hasn't been asked to. And what her peripheral vision caught, a single line at the top of the first page, made the brush in her hand stop completely, as if someone had grabbed her wrist. The translation was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in a vague way, but wrong from the foundation down to catastrophe. The kind of wrong that makes everything built on top of it wrong too. The kind of wrong that explained with absolute clarity why 11 experts had spent 2 weeks getting nowhere. Reed had read the opening chain of symbols in the ledger as a base 12 mathematical code, a reasonable assumption, and almost certainly what the system had been designed to resemble. But it wasn't. It was a double-entry bookkeeping system from the earliest era of organized crime in Chicago, so old that no one had studied it formally in more than a century. Wren knew this because her grandmother had kept a book, that small handwritten notebook wrapped in cracked leather that Wren had been told never to show anyone, documenting this exact system along with many other things. Her grandmother called it the old language, the language from before experts decided they knew better. Wren looked at the paper. She looked at the brush. She looked at the bucket of water. She looked at the doorway. Then she looked back at the paper. And the part of her mind she'd spent 3 years trying to gag rose up like water through a crack in old stone and said, very clearly, very simply, fix it. She shouldn't have. She knew that even as she set the brush down, even as she picked up the pen lying beside the inkwell, every instinct that had kept her alive and safe and invisible for 3 years screamed at her to put the pen down, pick up the brush, and finish scrubbing the floor. She fixed it. One small line, one margin note, smaller than a thumbnail, pointing out the foundational error and the correct reference system. She wrote in the smallest, most controlled handwriting she could manage, put the pen back exactly where she'd found it, picked up the brush again, and finished the floor in silence. She was back in the kitchen passage with her bucket before the experts returned after lunch. She thought, maybe naively, that it would end there. It didn't end there. Reed Calloway found the note within an hour of coming back to the room. Wren knew because Nina Cross, who had ears and eyes everywhere in the mansion, reported over dinner that there'd been a big commotion on the 3rd floor. Loud voices, things being moved fast, then a very long silence, and after that Calloway demanded an emergency meeting with Josiah. Wren ate her dinner. She kept her face perfectly still. She thought about the note, whether the handwriting could be traced back to her, and concluded with a thin sliver of relief that she'd disguised it well enough. Maybe. Almost certainly. The next morning, Mrs. Holloway came for her before breakfast. No explanation, no warning, just a short nod, and the words "follow me" in the voice of someone who wasn't used to being questioned twice. Wren was taken upstairs, not to the 3rd floor office, but to Josiah Kent's private room, a room she had never stepped into. A room she only knew in the abstract the way servants know the outlines of rooms they aren't allowed to enter. It was smaller than she'd imagined. Darker. The walls were covered in maps. Not the decorative kind, the working kind. Marked in pen, layered with notes in multiple ink colors, and in a few places torn and taped back together with frustration still visible in the seams. A fireplace was burning far too hot for the weather outside, and in front of it, with his back to her as she entered, stood Josiah Kent. He didn't turn right away. He let the silence sit in the room long enough that someone with less control would have filled it with something they'd regret. Wren stayed near the door, hands folded over her apron, and waited. She thought about this moment in the 30 seconds Mrs. Holloway led her to the door. She thought about a lot of things in those 30 seconds. When he finally turned, she kept her eyes at a respectful distance, not down on the floor because that would look guilty, but not straight into his face because that would look like a challenge. Josiah Kent looked at her the way she imagined. He looked at the ledger, like a problem he wasn't sure yet how to approach. He was taller than she'd realized from far away. The permanent tension in his jaw was sharper up close, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that the portrait hanging in the main hall didn't have, a portrait that must have been painted before obsession took over his face. He lifted a sheet of paper. Read Calloway's notes, with her correction in the margin clearly visible near the top. "One of my experts informed me," Josiah said, and his voice was controlled, calibrated. The voice of a man who'd learned to keep everything inside at exactly the right pressure, that someone went into the office yesterday and corrected his foundational methodology. He's very angry. He's also, if the adjustments written on this page are correct, completely wrong about everything he's been doing for the past 2 weeks. A pause. "Mrs. Holloway informed me that the only person who entered the room outside the roster yesterday was a low-ranking servant assigned to scrub the floor." Wren said nothing. "I'm going to ask you once," Josiah said, "and I want the truth. Did you write that note?" The room was very quiet. The fireplace crackled. Outside the window, the wind moved through the estate grounds, and somewhere far off, a door slammed against its hinges. "Yes," Wren said. The word dropped into the room and didn't move. Josiah set the paper down on the desk. He pulled a chair out from behind it and sat. Not like someone relaxing, but like someone deciding something. He looked at her for a long time, truly looked, in a way she realized almost no one in this mansion had ever bothered to do. And then he said, "Sit down." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't cold either. It was the voice of a man who'd run out of time to pretend the normal rules still applied. Wren sat. What happened after that wasn't the conversation she'd prepared for, because there was no version of her life where she could have prepared for it. Josiah didn't ask where she'd learned an ancient accounting system. He asked something more precise, and therefore far more dangerous. He asked what else she could see in the ledger that the experts had missed. "I know what you are," he said, and there was no contempt in his voice, no feigned surprise, only the cold accuracy of someone who'd spent his whole life measuring people. "I'm asking what you can do." That was, she would think later, the most dangerous question anyone had ever asked her, because the real answer, the full answer, the answer that contained everything she was and where she came from and everything that had been stolen from her family and hidden behind a staged accusation of betrayal, was an answer that could either save her completely or destroy her completely. She didn't give him the full answer. Not yet, but she gave him enough. The second layer of the ledger took Wren 4 hours. Josiah cleared the third-floor office of every expert, every assistant, and every piece of their equipment, stacking their notes and tools out in the hallway with an efficiency that suggested he'd been waiting for an excuse to do this for a long time. He placed Wren at the central table with the ledger directly in front of her, brought in fresh candles, then stood at just the right distance, close enough to watch, far enough not to crowd her, and waited. Wren worked in silence. She didn't ask anything. She didn't explain her process while she was doing it. She moved around the ledger the way she moved through the mansion's rooms, quietly, methodically, amber eyes sweeping across the page with an intensity of focus completely unlike the people downstairs, so unlike that if Nina Cross had been there to see it, she might have been speechless for the first time in her life. The ancient double-entry bookkeeping system, once applied correctly, did exactly what Wren had suspected. The symbols restructured themselves. The geometric patterns the experts had assumed were decoration dissolved into something purposeful, lines intersecting at specific points, arcs describing angles instead of ornament, a dense spatial language that in many ways was simpler than the outermost layer, but demanded an entirely different way of reading. You couldn't approach it with analysis. You had to keep a loose grip, let the relationships between symbols rise on their own, instead of forcing them apart. It was, Wren thought, the kind of recording system designed specifically to defeat people who overthink, which explained pretty neatly why 11 experts had failed. By the time the candles had burned down to half their length, she had an answer. Not everything. There were more layers in the ledger. She could feel them the way you feel a room behind a closed door, but enough. She traced the final configuration with her finger, not touching the paper, following the lines in the air above it, then straightened and turned toward Josiah where he stood. "There's a subterranean vault," she said. Underground. The symbol system describes an underground structure accessed from within the estate grounds. The instructions are encoded in coordinates she believed corresponded to specific points on Ashford's land. She held his gaze steadily. "The ledger isn't the end of the puzzle. It's the beginning of a path. Josiah stood very still. The Ashford Vault, he said softly, as if he were speaking a name he'd been afraid to say out loud. The ledger calls it the archive, Wren said. But yes, she believed it was what his family still called the vault. He crossed the room in 4 long steps and stopped beside her at the table, looking down at the ledger with an expression that was part relief and part something more complicated, something that looked in the candlelight a lot like awe. He was close enough for her to see the silver thread at his shirt collar, the ink stain on his right index finger, the single deep crease between his brows carved there by months of desperate focus. He turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked into the office that morning, he didn't look like a man bracing to be disappointed. "Who are you?" he asked. It was a gentle question, sincere, not performative, the kind of question that deserved a real answer. "Wren Abbott," she said. "I scrub floors for you." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite, but close to the territory where a smile could exist. "Not anymore," he said. That night, in the small basement room reserved for low-ranking servants, Wren sat on the narrow bed with a thin sheet that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent, and she opened her grandmother's notebook. She turned the yellowed pages with fingers still rough from cold water and floor brushes, and for the first time in 3 years, she cried. Not from fear, not from regret over the margin note that had changed everything, but because someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one had since her grandmother was alive. "Who are you?" he'd asked. And that question, that gentle, honest question, not meant to test her but to genuinely want to know, touched something inside her she'd thought had died a long time ago. She remembered the night her grandmother left. Cook County Hospital, 4th floor, a shared room with 5 other beds, fluorescent lights flickering in the hallway and disinfectant that wasn't strong enough to hide the smell of sickness. Wren was 16, sitting on a plastic chair beside the bed, holding her grandmother's hand, that bony, trembling hand with fingers that had once written every line in the notebook. Wren was now holding on this narrow bed. Her grandmother was Edith, and Edith had lived 72 years by becoming invisible, by hiding her real name and her real inheritance and everything that made her dangerous behind the harmless face of a poor old woman on the South Side nobody bothered to notice. She kept that secret her whole life, and she passed it to Wren not through lectures but through the small, cracked leather notebook, pressing it into her granddaughter's hand on the last night with words. Wren could still hear syllable by syllable even though 11 years had gone by. "Keep this notebook," she'd said, her voice so hoarse Wren had to lean close to her lips. "Don't ever let anyone know you can read it, and when the right person appears, you'll know." Then she closed her eyes, and Wren sat there under the flickering fluorescent light, 16 years old, completely alone in the world, holding the hand of someone who was already gone, and refusing to let go for 2 hours, until a nurse came and gently peeled her fingers away. After that came the part she never told anyone. She didn't have money. She didn't have insurance. She didn't have any other family to call. She sat in the hospital's administrative office with eyes dried out and filled out the paperwork for the county's free burial program, because it was the only option. And 2 weeks later, she stood in a public cemetery on the city's southwest side, facing a patch of ground with no headstone, no flowers, nothing but fresh brown soil and weeds beginning to creep in at the edges. And she made a vow, not a grand vow, not revenge or justice or any of the things books and movies say you're supposed to swear in a moment like that. She only vowed to survive. That was it. Survive. And she kept that vow for 11 years, through foster homes, through the streets, through nights sleeping in cars, through the back door of Ashford Estate, through 3 years of scrubbing floors, and keeping her eyes down, and staying invisible. Now she sat on the narrow bed in the basement, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Her grandmother's notebook open on her lap, and she thought about the last thing Edith had said. "When the right person appears, you'll know." She pressed the notebook to her chest, the cracked leather cover cool through her shirt, and she wondered if her grandmother had known. If she'd known that the right person would be a 37-year-old mafia boss with the eyes of a man carrying a countdown clock in his ribs, a man who'd looked at her across a desk and asked, "Who are you?" not to challenge her, but because he truly wanted to know the answer. The invitation came 3 days later. A cream-colored envelope, stamped with the raised logo of the Victor Lang Foundation, sat on Josiah's desk when Wren was called upstairs that afternoon. Inside was a copper-lettered card inviting the recipient to a black-tie charity fundraising gala at the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago, hosted by Victor Lang himself, to mark the anniversary of the charitable foundation that carried his name. Half the guests would be legitimate business people. The other half would be people no court in Illinois wanted to see sitting in the same room together. Josiah set the card down and told Wren. His intelligence said Victor Lang had recently purchased an ancient manuscript, something Josiah had reason to believe contained the final contextual key needed to unlock the deepest layer of the ledger. The problem was access. Josiah could attend the gala without difficulty. Wren couldn't, not as herself, not in her current position, not in a world where a floor-scrubbing servant showing up at an elite party would spark the kind of speculation that destroyed reputations before breakfast the next morning. Josiah solved the problem with the blunt efficiency of a man who'd decided obstacles were things to be removed. He brought Wren to the upstairs sitting room, where a woman named Elise Rourke, a tailor with considerable skill and equally considerable discretion, had been driven in from downtown in a black-windowed car and was waiting with fabric, measuring tape, and the focused silence of someone paid very well not to ask questions. Wren stood in the middle of the room and let herself be measured, and tried not to think too hard about what she was about to do. The gown, finished 2 days later, was deep blue, chosen at Josiah's direction. It was clearly selected because it carried authority without showing off, memorable without screaming for attention. It fit her with almost aggressive precision, tracing every line that 3 years of physical labor had carved into her body and turning them into something no one at the gala would ever associate with a floor-scrubbing maid. Professional makeup covered the calluses and the roughness. Her black hair was swept into a high chignon and pinned with a precision Wren could only describe as architecture, rather than fashion. Small diamond earrings, borrowed from somewhere she decided not to ask about, caught the light every time she turned her head. She looked into the mirror, brought in for the final adjustments, and the woman looking back at her wasn't unrecognizable. But she was different in every way the world used to classify people. The posture was still hers. The eyes were still hers, amber and watchful, but everything the world used to look through her had been replaced by everything the world used to look at someone. The effect disoriented her so completely that she stood very still for a moment, just breathing. Josiah came to collect her, something she hadn't expected. He stood in the sitting room doorway in a black suit, different from his everyday clothing. This one kept immaculate, silver stitching at the cuffs catching the lamplight, and he looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't fully read. But that made something in her chest do something she stubbornly categorized as irrelevant. "You'll be introduced as Corinne Ashby," he said, a distant acquaintance visiting, recently recovered from a minor illness, which would explain any unfamiliarity with the current social rumors. He paused. "Can you do it?" Wren thought about 3 years of being invisible in a house full of people. She thought about the careful performance of smallness she'd maintained every day since she arrived at Ashford. "I've pretended to be someone else for a lot longer than one evening," she said. Josiah studied her for a moment. Then he held his hand out, and Wren looked at that hand. A hand she knew had pulled a trigger. A hand that had signed orders nobody in this room would ever speak out loud. The most dangerous hand she'd ever been invited to touch. She placed her hand in it, and what she felt wasn't danger. It was warmth. That was all. Warmth. And she couldn't remember the last time anyone's hand had been warm with her. The party was everything she'd ever read about in books, and never thought she'd step into. Candlelight multiplied in the mirrors until the entire room seemed made of fire. Music drifted down from the chamber orchestra on the balcony above, the soft rustle of silk and satin, and the low murmurs of conversations that carried entire political maps inside their carefully chosen syllables. The Drake Hotel on gala night felt like a living creature, breathing champagne and expensive perfume and that nameless scent power leaves in the air when it passes by. Josiah moved through it all with the ease of a man who fully belonged here, but she noticed he kept her close at his side beyond what polite distance allowed, close enough that anyone watching would read it as something more than professional. His hand rested lightly at the middle of her back as they passed through the crowd, and she felt the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her deep blue gown, and she reminded herself this was staging, strategy, part of the cover, and whatever warmth spread outward from that point of contact was completely irrelevant. Victor Lang was exactly what his reputation suggested. Charming on the surface the way marble is charming, cold and glossy and flawless, until a finger touches it and finds nothing but room temperature. 40 years old, prematurely gray at the temples in a way he clearly considered an asset, and eyes that counted everything they saw, counting value, counting threat, counting opportunity, at a speed most people reserved for breathing. Josiah introduced her as Corinne Ashby with perfect composure, and Victor Lang bowed over her hand with a smile that never reached those counting eyes. The conversation that followed demanded everything Wren had. Victor Lang wasn't a man who could be rushed or easily distracted, but he carried an arrogance about his own intellect, a hunger to be recognized as the smartest person in the room that Wren identified within the first 3 minutes of speaking to him, and she used it with the precision of someone who'd spent years reading a room. She asked the right questions. She displayed exactly the right degree of impressed confusion, the kind of confusion that makes the other person feel smarter and therefore want to talk more. She guided him gently and invisibly toward the subject of the manuscript, without ever seeming to move toward it, the way water finds its way through a crack, not forcing, not hurrying, just following the natural gravity of conversation until it reached where it needed to go. By the end of it, she had the information Josiah needed, not the manuscript, but something almost more valuable. She knew where it was being kept. She knew what part of it connected to the ledger, and she knew, from a careless line Victor let slip when he clearly believed he was speaking from a level of understanding above hers, that someone else was also searching for that same thing, someone in Reed Calloway's contact list. She held that knowledge quietly in her ribcage for the rest of the evening, carrying it beneath the deep blue gown like a second skin. And when Josiah finally led her out the front doors into the cold night air, and the black SUV was brought around, she saw him, a man standing in the shadows at the edge of the parking area, a phone lifted at an angle that could only mean he was taking photos, the lens aimed straight at her and Josiah. His face showed only partly under the streetlight, enough to remember but not enough to identify immediately. Wren didn't break stride. She didn't turn her head. She didn't change her pace. She slid into the vehicle with the same composure she'd carried all night, and she etched that face into her photographic memory with the same precision she gave to anything her mind decided mattered. In the black SUV on the way back, while Chicago's streetlights swept across the windows in a steady rhythm like a pulse, Wren told Josiah everything she'd gathered that night. She told it precisely, in order, without adding or cutting anything, where the manuscript was kept inside Victor's estate, which portion connected to the deepest layer of the ledger, and the careless line, the line Victor had let slip with the smug smile of a man convinced he was speaking above her level, revealing that someone in Reed Calloway's contact network was searching for the same thing. Josiah listened without interrupting. When she finished, the vehicle went quiet for a long time, only tires on pavement and their breathing in the enclosed space. Calloway, he said, and the way he said that name, flat and heavy, like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well, made it clear this was a name he'd once trusted. Then he said nothing else for the rest of the drive, and Wren didn't fill the silence, because she understood there were silences that needed to be left alone. The letter arrived a few days later. That was what Wren kept circling back to in her mind. Not its contents, not its implications, not the ice-cold feeling that sank into her stomach the moment she understood what she was reading. What she kept returning to was the simple, almost insulting fact that Reed Calloway, a man who'd spent 30 years building a reputation for precision and intellectual rigor, had hidden his most dangerous letter inside an old law book, spine facing outward on the secondary shelf in the office, wedged between 2 books no one ever bothered to reach for. He'd hidden it in a place he deemed beneath the notice of anyone significant, betting that a servant would see only a dusty book rather than a key to his betrayal, where a servant would find it. Because a servant, in Reed Calloway's assessment, couldn't read, Wren was returning a few ink bottles to the supply cabinet in the office. A small errand, an insignificant task, the kind that required her to pass the secondary shelf, when the corner of a folded paper caught her eye. It wasn't the paper that made her stop. It was the seal, a small wax stamp, cracked at the edge where the fold had broken it, bearing a symbol she'd seen once before in her grandmother's notebook, the mark of a rival lineage that had been stripped of its status 40 years earlier and, according to official records, never restored. According to official records. She stood in the office for a moment that felt longer than it truly was, ink bottles still in her hands. Then she set them down on the nearest surface, pulled the letter from the shelf, and read. It took less than 2 minutes. The language was careful, coded in places, but not coded enough. Not for her. not for someone raised by a grandmother who spoke in layered meanings the way other people breathed. The meaning assembled itself in her mind with horrifying clarity. Reed Calloway hadn't failed to decode the ledger. He'd decoded enough to understand the general direction, and had been reporting the results to Victor Lang's people for 2 weeks, feeding them just enough to keep their interest while deliberately sending Josiah down the wrong path. The plan, as she extracted it from the careful wording, was to drain Josiah's resources and strength into a translation that led nowhere until Victor's side could access the Ashford vault independently, at which point all evidence would vanish from the mansion's history completely. The curse wouldn't be broken, and Josiah Kent would be dead within 2 years. No heir, no defense. And then Wren understood. The man in the Drake parking area, the face half lit and half shadowed under the streetlight that she'd etched into her photographic memory, hadn't been a coincidence. He was Victor's man. They were being watched. Time was running out, far faster than the 2 years Josiah believed he had left. She folded the letter back exactly the way she'd found it. She slid it into the law book. She picked up the ink bottles and finished the errand. Then she went to find Josiah. She had never gone to find him on her own before. In the weeks since that morning in the office, since the third-floor room, since the party, every interaction between them had followed a certain pattern. He summoned, she came, they worked, she returned to her duties. It was the system that preserved the appearance of normalcy for the rest of the mansion, something Wren understood was necessary and accepted without comment. But necessity has its own schedule, and right now necessity was pushing hard in only one direction. She found him in the east courtyard of the estate, standing over a survey map spread across a built stone pedestal, comparing it to a handwritten transcript she recognized as her own translation of the ledger's second layer. Late afternoon light slanted through the trees at the edge of the grounds and threw long shadows across the stone, and Josiah stood among those shadows, with the concentration of a man trying to match a map on paper to the land beneath his feet. He looked up when she appeared at the courtyard entrance, and something in her expression must have conveyed the urgency because he straightened immediately. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why she was there. He only straightened and waited. The way she'd learned was his instinct, whenever he sensed something important was coming. She told him about the letter. She told it precisely, in order, without adding commentary. She'd learned in the weeks working beside him that Josiah Kent processed information best when it arrived clean and complete, that he didn't need her interpretation until he had enough facts, and that he, beneath the weight and the tension, had an extraordinarily sharp mind when given the right material to work with. She told him where Reed had hidden the letter. She told him who the wax seal belonged to. She told him what the letter revealed, that Reed had decoded part of it and had been feeding it to Victor's side, that everything Calloway had done for the past 2 weeks had been a deliberate performance, that the final plan was for the evidence to disappear and for Josiah to die with no way to defend himself. She told him about the man in the Drake parking area and that she now believed he was Victor's man watching them. When she finished, the east courtyard was very quiet. Josiah looked down at the survey map. His right hand lay flat on the paper, and she watched his fingers press down slowly, harder and harder, as if he were steadying himself against something physical trying to knock him over. "How long?" he said at last, and his voice had the particular quality of something being held very tightly. "Has he been in this house?" 22 days, Wren said. 22 days. A pause. "And in 17 days, he's fed everything we know to Victor's people." "Not everything," Wren said carefully. "The letter shows he doesn't have the second layer. He knows the ledger has a second layer. He noted its existence. But he doesn't have the readout. He wasn't in the room when I decoded it." Josiah lifted his gaze to her, and in his expression there was something she hadn't seen before, something that was gratitude but also more than gratitude, something neighboring relief but carrying an entirely different weight. "Then we're still ahead of them," he said. "For now," Wren said. "But if he reported about the party, Victor will know we're after the manuscript. He'll move faster." Josiah folded the survey map. He pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his suit jacket with a motion she recognized as having no panic, but also no hesitation. The motion of a man who'd decided and was already executing. He called Jonah and said 4 words in a voice Wren had never heard from him before. Utterly cold. Nothing inside it but pure decision. "Lock Calloway up." Then he hung up and looked at Wren. "Then we move faster too," he said. He took a step toward the courtyard exit, then stopped. He didn't fully turn, only tilted his head just enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the shape of his eye in the late afternoon light. "Are you scared?" he asked. And that question, in any other circumstance, from any other person, would have sounded like concern or a test. But from Josiah Kent it sounded like something else. It sounded like a man giving her a chance to step back before everything became irreversible. Wren looked at him. "I've been scared since I was 14, she said. "I'm just better at hiding it than you are." And for the first time, Josiah Kent, the man the entire Chicago underworld feared, looked at her with something she could only describe as real respect. They went down at dawn on Thursday, in the hour before sunrise when the mansion was at its quietest and the sky outside carried that dense, deep blue that exists only briefly between true night and the first gray suggestion of morning. Josiah had spent 2 days preparing, gathering specific tools, flashlights, rope, mechanical lock-picking devices she didn't ask the origin of, memorizing Wren's translation of the second layer until he could follow the instructions without opening a page, arranging for Mrs. Holloway to believe Wren had been assigned to a distant storage building at the edge of the grounds for the morning, the kind of work no one checked and no one noticed when it was finished. The preparations were careful and thorough, and Wren watched them with the part of her mind that always evaluated, always categorized, always noted what the person in front of her understood and what they didn't. What Josiah didn't understand, what she hadn't told him, was that the route described in the ledger's second layer didn't end at the vault entrance. It described a sequence of corridors, each segment sealed by a mechanism that demanded specific knowledge to pass. Not physical strength, not tools, knowledge, the kind of knowledge handed down through families, not taught in schools or government agencies, the kind recorded in small handwritten notebooks, wrapped in cracked leather. She had her grandmother's notebook in her inner pocket, where she'd carried it for 3 years, pressed tight to her skin, the way other people carried a prayer. The vault entrance lay beneath the oldest building on the Ashford grounds, a low stone structure at the farthest edge that the people in the mansion called the old pump house and used to store broken equipment no one bothered to throw out. The floor beneath 2 generations of accumulated clutter, rusted lawnmowers, old piping, paint cans hardened shut, concealed a trapdoor integrated into the stone so perfectly that only the precise measurements from the ledger's spatial symbol system could locate it. Josiah found it within 20 minutes of starting the search, exactly where the symbol system said it would be, and when he looked up at Wren from where he knelt on the floor, with the expression of a man still getting used to the experience of everything working exactly as described, she felt something warm and complicated move through her ribcage that she once again chose to categorize as irrelevant. The corridor below was narrow. The stone walls were old in a way different from the mansion's age. Older, predating the era when the Kent family owned the property, built by working hands for a different standard and a different purpose. The air was cold and smelled of minerals, clean in the way things are clean when no living creature has stirred them for a very long time. Josiah went first with the flashlight, and Wren followed with the symbol system in her memory and her grandmother's notebook pressed against her ribs. The flashlight beam swept across the stone and made shadows that moved like something breathing underground, and their footsteps were the only sound, steady, careful, softly echoing in the narrow space. She watched his back ahead of her, the way he moved through darkness with the disciplined caution of a man used to operating in places where one wrong step could be the last, and she thought this was the first time in 3 years she was walking behind someone without feeling like she was being led. She was choosing to follow. And that difference, small and quiet as she was something she felt in every footstep on the cold stone floor. The first mechanism was a door, or rather something that looked like a door, a slab of stone set into the corridor wall, its surface covered in the same layered symbol system as the ledger, its edges sealed with no hinges and no handle. At the center was a recessed circular panel, divided into 12 segments, each segment bearing a symbol from the ancient accounting system. Josiah lifted the flashlight closer and studied it. After a moment, he reached toward the panel. "No," Wren said softly. He stopped. Instantly, without hesitation, without asking why before he stopped. He simply stopped. And the trust contained in that reflex, the willingness to freeze his hand at once because she'd said a single word, was something Wren felt more sharply than anything else in this cold corridor. "It's not a combination," she said, stepping past him to stand in front of the panel. "It's a reading comprehension test. The segments have to be read in the correct sequence, starting not from the first month but from the first closing period. The ancient accounting calendar begins at an entirely different point than any modern system. She studied the symbols on the panel, then looked at him. If you pressed the wrong order, she believed the corridor would seal completely. A pause behind her. "How do you know that?" Josiah asked. And it wasn't exactly a question. "I know the symbol system," Ren said. And that was true. And it also wasn't the full truth. And both of them understood both of those things at the same time. Something was accumulating in the space between what she said and what she didn't say. And they both felt it. And they both left it there untouched. Not yet. Not the time. She pressed the segments in the correct sequence. 7 segments. 7 closing periods in the ancient accounting calendar. The system her grandmother had recorded, stroke by stroke in the cracked leather notebook, now pressed against Ren's ribs. Her finger moved with certainty, without hesitation, with the confidence of someone reading a native language the world had forgotten, and the stone slab shifted inward, without a sound, without a tremor. It turned on a mechanism built with such precision it felt modern, felt impossible, felt like something made by people operating at a level far beyond their own era. Josiah stood watching the stone doorway open into darkness behind it. And in the flashlight beam, Ren saw his expression change. Not much, just slightly, but enough. It was the expression of a man beginning to understand that what he was stepping into was far bigger than anything he'd prepared for. The second challenge came an hour deeper underground, when the simple corridor floor vanished. There was no warning, no sign. The corridor ended, and a wide room opened ahead with a low ceiling, the floor sitting nearly 2 meters below the corridor's edge, and the room's surface covered by a grid of 36 raised stone squares, some clearly stable and some clearly not. The flashlight beam showed where the unstable squares had collapsed, their broken edges pale against the deep floor below, the remnants of attempts made before, long before, by people who never reached the far side. There were no instructions for this test in the ledger. Nothing in the second layer described this room directly, or how to cross it. Ren stood at the corridor's edge and stared down at the grid and felt that old familiar sensation, the sensation of a puzzle pressing against the inside of her skull, demanding to be let in, demanding to be processed, demanding to be solved. Josiah stood beside her, close, in the narrow space of the corridor edge, closer than necessary, or maybe exactly as necessary, when two people are standing on the lip of an underground void, and she was aware of him in a way that was becoming inconvenient. His stillness, the quality of his focus when he was thinking, the way he didn't fill space with meaningless words, but let silence do its work, the way the flashlight cut across the planes of his face as he turned to survey the room, bright then dark then bright again, and she realized she was watching him instead of watching the grid, and forced her eyes back to where they needed to be. "The stable squares," she said, studying the stone grid. "Look at the surface grain, not symbols but texture, the squares with the cross-hatched pattern. They correspond to coordinates in the third layer of the ledger, a layer she hadn't fully decoded yet but had seen enough pattern to recognize a consistent navigation grid system. She needed to think. She told Josiah that, and he said, in a plain voice, "Take as long as you need." And the plainness of it, no impatience, no pressure, only the clean confidence that she would find the answer, did something to her composure she had to work to hide. She found the path. It took 11 minutes, 18 squares out of 36, along a route that looked random but followed a logic so precise it was almost beautiful once you could see it. She went first because she had the logic in her head and he had the flashlight in his hand, and they agreed without discussion that this was the right division of labor. She stepped from square to square, certain, exact, and he followed one step at a time, placing his foot exactly where she had placed hers, trusting her logic completely without needing explanation or confirmation. And when they reached the far side and the corridor continued ahead, he let out a breath she knew he'd been holding the entire way across. "You're extraordinary," he said softly, and not in the voice of praise but in the voice of stating an observed fact, the voice of a man saying something he considered as obvious as sunrise, and somehow that landed far harder than any compliment. "We should keep moving," she said, and kept walking, because if she stopped right now, she wasn't sure she could control her expression, and there were things the darkness underground shouldn't be allowed to see. The corridor narrowed until it was only wide enough for one person, shoulders nearly brushing the walls on both sides, then opened without warning into a room so large Josiah's flashlight couldn't reach the far wall. And at the center of that room, lit by a source of light you couldn't see, giving off a cold gold glow with no heat and no shadows, was a trap mechanism so intricate, so ancient, that they both stopped the instant they saw it. It was built around a central pillar, a pale stone column made of the same material and covered in the same layered symbol system as the ledger, glowing from within with that cold gold light. Around the base of the pillar, a ring of interlocked metal arms, each arm ending in a curved blade, rotated slowly in opposite directions at different speeds. The rotation pattern wasn't random. It was a mechanism, a puzzle made out of movement, and it was designed, Ren understood with the certainty of someone reading a text in her native language, to kill anyone who approached without understanding its logic. Josiah stepped forward. "Stop," Ren said, and the word came out with more force than she intended. More force than a floor-scrubbing servant was supposed to use with a mafia boss, and she didn't apologize for it. He stopped. He turned to look at her, and the way he looked, steady, trusting, not a trace of the contempt she'd been bracing against since her first morning in the office, cracked something inside her that had been sealed for 3 years. She'd meant to tell him. Somewhere beneath conscious thought she'd known this moment was coming, that these corridors had been designed for someone who knew what she knew, that the symbol system on the stone pillar had been created by people who shared blood with her, and that there would come a time when keeping the secret would get someone killed. She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out the notebook. "My grandmother's name," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised even her, was Edith Abbott. Before that, she was Edith Whitmore, and before that, before the accusation of betrayal destroyed everything and forced what was left of the family into hiding, her lineage name was the name carved into the foundations of the encoding system every underworld family in Chicago had used for nearly a century. She held the notebook so he could see the inside cover, where her grandmother's precise handwriting had written in ink faded brown with time, created by Whitmore hands, for the preservation of the foundation. Josiah looked at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "The original accounting bloodline," he said, not as a question but as recognition. "The betrayal accusation was staged," Ren said. "My family was set up by people who wanted the vault's secrets and needed the original accountants gone to get them. Everything my family built, everything they knew, everything they recorded, was supposed to vanish with them." She kept the notebook steady. It didn't vanish. It passed through the women, quietly, in notebooks like this, because no one thinks to check what women carry. The room was very still around them. The gold light from the pillar moved slowly, and the metal arms of the mechanism continued their patient, lethal rotation. Josiah watched her for a long moment, and in his expression there was something she hadn't expected. Not shock. Not the careful recalibration of a man adjusting his assessment of someone he'd misjudged. What was in his face looked a lot like relief. The relief of someone who'd known something wasn't complete and had just found the missing piece. "I told you," he said quietly, "that I didn't hire you by accident." The words fell into the room and didn't echo. He'd known. He knew the Abbott name traced back to Whitmore, and that a Whitmore would be able to read what no one else could read. He'd been searching for years. Then he said the last 4 words, in a way completely different from the rest. Lighter, more careful, the way people speak when they're being precise about something that truly matters. "I didn't know it would be you." And Ren, standing in that underground room with the gold light and the spinning blades and her grandmother's notebook in her hand, cried. In front of someone else, for the first time in 13 years. Not from sadness, not from fear, but because for 13 years, she'd carried the name Whitmore like a wound. This was the first person who said it out loud, not to accuse her, not to make her run, but to recognize her. She didn't wipe the tears away, and he didn't pretend he couldn't see them. "The final mechanism," Ren said, and her voice had returned to the steadiness of someone who'd finished crying and was working again, because there was still danger and still work to be done. "The symbol system on the pillar describes it in the 3rd layer. I solved it in my head from the moment we entered the corridor." She opened the notebook to the last page that had been written in, and set her finger on the relevant passage. "It requires someone to step into the center of the rotating ring, pass through the moving arms, and stand at the central position of the stone pillar. Here," she pointed to the symbol in the notebook. "The mechanism is designed to test intent. Pure intent, the symbols say. The one who approaches does so not to take but to restore. The arms won't close if the person steps in the correct way and stands at the center." She looked at the rotating blades. "But if the intent is wrong, They'll close. The silence stretched. And you intend to be the one who steps in, Josiah said. I'm the one who can read the approach sequence, Wren said. And I'm the one whose family built it. If anyone's intent qualifies, it's mine. No, Josiah said. He said it very softly. Then he reached out and took the notebook from her hands, with a gentleness completely at odds with the word he'd just spoken. So gentle his fingers almost didn't touch hers at all, and yet they touched enough for her to feel a brief warmth on her skin, and the thing she'd been categorizing as irrelevant for weeks suddenly became very hard to categorize anywhere except exactly where it already was. Teach me how to read it, he said. Teach me the sequence. And his voice was the voice of someone making a decision that couldn't be negotiated. Not because he was a boss, not because he had power over her, but because that decision came from somewhere deeper than rank, somewhere that had nothing to do with the world above them and everything to do with what stood between them in the darkness, with the gold light and the spinning blades, and all the things that hadn't been said out loud. Wren taught him. She taught the approach sequence, the exact placement of each footstep, the specific orientation required at the center of the mechanism. She explained the symbol system with the quiet precision she used for everything, and he listened with the complete concentration he gave to every word she said. When she finished, he handed the notebook back to her. Stand here, he said. She watched him step into the mechanism. She had read the symbols correctly. She knew she had. She was certain. But certainty and watching a living human being move between spinning blades were two entirely different experiences, and the distance between them was something she felt in every part of her body at once. He moved exactly as she'd described, placed each footstep exactly where the sequence demanded. The blades kept rotating and they didn't close, and he reached the center of the stone pillar and placed both hands on the stone surface and stood there in the cold gold light and looked at Wren through the rotating arms. Now, he said. She recited the sequence out loud. Her voice didn't shake. She read from the notebook in her grandmother's handwriting, the old language, the system her family had spoken for generations, and hidden in plain sight, and carried through catastrophe and disgrace, and decades of enforced invisibility. Her voice rang through the underground room, and it didn't sound like the voice of a floor-scrubbing servant. It sounded like the voice of an heir. The stone pillar responded, not dramatically, not violently, like in stories. It responded the way real mechanisms respond when they're operated correctly, smooth, precise, with the calm authority of something that had waited a very long time to function as intended. The gold light intensified, then shifted, spreading outward through grooves in the floor that had been invisible before, illuminating a door in the far wall that hadn't been visible. The blades slowed, then stopped, and somewhere deep in the stone above them, in the mansion they'd left before dawn, something that had bound the Kent bloodline for decades was unfastened. Josiah stepped out of the mechanism the same way he'd stepped in, careful, deliberate, each step taken by a man who understood precision mattered, and he came to stand in front of Wren, and she realized she was still holding the notebook, and her hand wasn't entirely steady anymore. It worked, he said. It worked, she agreed. They looked at each other in that new light that had been sealed in stone for centuries and now moved freely through the room, and everything that had been gathering in the space between them through weeks of stone floors and candlelit offices and deep blue gowns and underground corridors arrived all at once, and neither of them looked away. The door in the far wall opened into the vault. Inside, sealed within boxes engineered with extraordinary craftsmanship, waterproof, fireproof, locked with a precision time itself couldn't touch, was everything. The original records of the first transaction between Chicago's underworld families, written in handwriting, Wren recognized immediately because it resembled her grandmother's so closely it hurt. Detailed proof of who had staged the framing of the Whitmore family, names, dates, motives, every link in the conspiracy recorded with the meticulousness of people who understood truth only has value when it's documented correctly. And the assassination network aimed at the Kent bloodline. Every incident, every generation, every death the outside world called an accident or coincidence, laid bare here with the ruthless clarity of accounting. Wren stood at the vault entrance and looked at it all. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the cracked leather notebook and the name written inside the cover in ink that had faded to brown. She thought about the public cemetery on the city's southwest side and the unmarked patch of ground. She thought about what it meant that the thing her family had protected for generations, had died protecting, had been erased for protecting, was finally in the hands of someone worthy to hold it. Josiah stood beside her. After a long while, he said, "Your family built this place." "Yes," Wren said. "My family was destroyed for protecting it." "Yes." The silence stretched. The kind of silence that had weight and direction. The kind of silence between two people who'd walked through darkness together and were now standing in light on the other side. "That won't stand," Josiah said. She looked at him. "The Whitmore name will be restored," he said. "I have the documentation. The original betrayal accusation was contested at the time, and the protest records still exist. It'll take effort. It'll take time. But it'll be done." He looked at the record boxes, then back at her. "And Wren Abbott won't be going back to scrubbing floors. I'm not sure I fit anything else after 3 years, she said. And there was the smallest edge of something in her voice that wasn't quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You fit," Josiah said, and there was nothing in his voice except quiet, absolute conviction for exactly this, for all of this. The estate's history, the vault, the ledger, none of it is something I can manage without someone who can read what I can't read. A pause. "I'm not asking you to be my employee." Wren waited. "I'm asking you to be my partner," he said, "in every way that matters." The vault was warm around them. Amber light moved slowly over ancient stone, and somewhere above, outside, the sun was rising over Ashford Estate for the first time on a morning that didn't carry threat in the air. Wren looked at the man beside her. A hard man, exhausted, unexpectedly honest. A man who'd looked at her and truly seen her, who'd followed her into darkness without hesitation, who'd asked, "Who are you?" not as a challenge, but as a sincere question. And she thought about all the years she'd spent making herself small and quiet and forgettable. She thought she was done with that. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to manage." "I've noticed," Josiah said. And this time, finally, the thing that had almost been a smile in the candlelight of the office, the thing that had nearly existed in the flashlight beam of the underground corridor, the thing that had hovered at the edge of his expression for weeks, arrived fully. Not a big smile. Not an easy smile, but real, complete, and it changed his face in a way Wren knew she would remember this exact moment for the rest of her life. "Then we have a deal," she said. The next morning, Wren stood by the window of a room upstairs. Her room now, not the basement servant room with the narrow bed and the thin sheet, but a room with windows looking out over the Ashford Estate in the dawn light. Morning spilled through the glass and painted everything in warm gold, and she stood there in clothes that weren't a servant's uniform and looked down at the grounds stretching below, the tree lines, the lawns, the old pump house at the far edge where she now knew what lay beneath, and she felt something it took her a moment to recognize. It was absence, the absence of fear. For the first time in 13 years, she woke up without carrying it on her chest like a stone. Josiah stood behind her. His hand rested lightly at her waist, and this was the first time he touched her, not because of a task, not because of a cover, not because of strategy, but because of choice. Simple, clean choice. And she didn't step away. She leaned back, just slightly, enough for her back to meet his chest, and she felt his breathing change rhythm, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. His phone vibrated. He took it out with his other hand, the first still at her waist, and read the message. Jonah. Calloway had confessed. Everything. Names, dates, contacts, plans. The entire network from Reed to Victor Lang peeled back layer by layer under the weight of evidence the vault had provided. Victor was retreating, fast and silent in the way of a man who knew the war had been lost before the final battle could happen. The original records had been copied and sent to the lawyers. Josiah finished reading and set the phone down. For the first time in his life, the threat was no longer ahead of him. Wren stared out the window at the dawn, spreading over Ashford. And she thought about the 14-year-old girl standing in a public cemetery in front of an unmarked patch of ground, clutching her grandmother's notebook to her chest, and swearing she would survive. That girl wouldn't have believed where she was standing now. That girl wouldn't have believed the cracked leather notebook would open a stone door underground, that the name she carried like a wound would be spoken by a man in the gentlest voice he had to recognize instead of accuse, that hands rough from scrubbing floors would solve what 11 experts couldn't. But that girl had always known one thing. Being looked through doesn't mean being powerless, and the forgotten people always carry the most extraordinary secrets. If you've made it to the end of this story, then you understand what it took Ren 13 years to live through. That sometimes the greatest strength isn't in the loudest voice in the room, but in the quietest person, the one kneeling on the floor with a brush in their hand and an entire universe in their mind. That the wounds we carry don't define us, but the way we carry them does. And that no matter how many times the world has looked through you, it only takes one person, the right person, to truly see you. And everything can change. Did this story touch something in you? Have you ever felt looked through, underestimated, boxed into something smaller than who you really are? Share with us in the comments below. We read every single comment, and we want to hear the voice from deep in your heart. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to be reminded they're not invisible, and subscribe to the channel to join us every day for more moving and inspiring stories. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.